powered by Reviting, streaming from the Reviting Digital Studio. It's the David Daily. Exploring frontier technology, artificial intelligence, quantum innovation, and the intersection of faith, funding, and the future. Here's your host, David Goki.
Welcome to another episode of the David Daily Show, streaming live today from El Salvador in Central America. And we are missing the snow here. But if you're in a snowy area in New York, if you're on the West Coast, even the Midwest, lots of snow this week, and in fact, record snowstorms. But today, I'm very excited to actually talk about our special guest on our segment called Funding, Faith, and Future Tech. And Scott, just in the pre-show, was telling us so many amazing, incredible things. I do want to highlight that he is a University of Michigan graduate. So go Big Ten schools, go Midwestern college kids who are in the city. So Scott's in New York City up at 56th and Park. He's managing a fund for nonprofits. We're going to get into it. It's going to be really fantastic. And then we have a special segment. Make sure you stick behind for the end, Beyond the Bag, where we pick something out of our travel bag and show you exactly what we travel with technology-wise. So without further ado, I'd like to invite Scott to the stage. Scott, welcome. It's so good to have you here, my friend.
Yeah, thank you, David. Thank you for having me.
Fantastic. So I'd love for you to just introduce yourself slightly. Tell the audience a little bit about who you are and who you serve.
Yeah, so I'm Scott Stevens. I'm the founder and CEO of Grace Peak Capital. We're an investment fund based in both in New York and Los Angeles with a couple smaller offices, but we focus on venture capital, private equity, and private credit. And within the private credit space, we've launched a fund called the Impact Credit Fund that specifically helps to provide financing for the nonprofit community, which is something we're very excited about to talk about.
Yeah, I'm excited about that as well. Now, from a nonprofit and service perspective, the nonprofit we highlight on this show is one called AI and Faith. So AI and Faith is a beautiful organization that is self-funded and mostly volunteer-based, but focuses on bringing the world's wisdom together to integrate that with and technology concepts, specifically around ethics and moral implementation of tech. So I'm excited to get into that. But our first topic today is how nonprofits actually raise capital and secure financing. What does that even mean for the nonprofits that are watching if they want to raise funding?
I think there's some ways that people are aware and a lot of the ways that people are not aware. So typically a nonprofit, the myth is that almost all the funding comes from donations, right? I think that's where a lot of people view. If you look at some of the larger nonprofits, whether it's Salvation Army or United Way or some of these, typically people view that they're going to raise money from just donations. If you look at the nonprofit world, a lot of them are really more like small, medium businesses, not what I would typical kind of like charitable nonprofits. And so a lot of them actually raise money from either earned income. It could be also from donations. It could be from them investing in securities. They own real estate. So I think there's a lot of other ways beyond donations. But typically nonprofits will set up either a website or a portal. They will do an email campaign or a call campaign. I think that's typical of what you would see. I think with technology and AI, you're seeing that the nonprofits are using tech tools to be, smarter, to figure out who they should be in front of, the frequency they should be in front of potential donors. Then also on the communication and marketing, right? They're figuring out different channels, whether it's YouTube, whether it's LinkedIn or Instagram. I think there's a lot different ways for the nonprofits now to effectively reach out to the donation community. I think a lot of that stems into the storytelling part of it. I think the marketing part of it is now becoming a key part. A lot of nonprofits are outsourcing that. But I think that, marketing and digital marketing and how you tell a story is one of the key parts of both any organization or business. And I think that's changing a lot with technology.
Yeah, I'm glad that you brought that up, especially storytelling, this idea that, hey, we all have our own personal story, right? But we also have the stories that bring us together and where we live and work and play. And as we bring humans together, organizations are nothing but, right, a gathering of humans together. And so that personal storytelling is really important. I'm glad you brought that up. So as a nonprofit is going through their funding journey, at what point does it make sense for them to, collaborate with you and your organization?
Yeah, I think in general, one of the things why we started this fund was there's enormous need and demand for it. So within the nonprofit community, almost 10% of the jobs in the U.S. are related to nonprofits, and almost 15% of U.S. GDP. So I think the nonprofit community is much bigger than people realize. I think there's a lot of different parts. One of the reasons we got into it is we were doing a lot with both federal and state municipal organizations, and we sat down with a lot of mayors and governors and said, what's one of the key pain points that you see? And one of the key pain points was in the communities that they just did not have access to capital, and that was capital from either banks or different types of credit unions. And they said, this is a real problem. This is kind of the lifeblood of how we think about after school training, how we think about after school sports, food kits, meal kits, all these things that were really, really important to the community. And they just mentioned that the banks with consolidation were having a very difficult time figuring out how to underwrite the nonprofits and how to lend to them. And so we created an entire tech stack that allowed both ourselves and other banks to be able to underwrite and effectively service some of these nonprofit loans. And so that has created this marketplace through our partner, Be Generous, that has really kind of, catapulted us into a large part of this market. And I think a lot of the times the funds are used for everything from, real estate, if donations lag. Sometimes we're helping some of the nonprofits payroll. Right, we see a lot of disruption in both state and municipal funding right now at the government level for lots of reasons. And so a lot of people have just said, look, this is a key thing that we need in the space to kind of keep our businesses running and to grow.
I like that a lot. Now, you talked about specifically your nonprofit. Can you tell us a little bit more about that, just to educate people who are tuning in for the first time?
Yeah, so we have a couple different parts of it, but every program that we've done at our fund level has some sort of charitable or contribution part of it. Some of that we do for different organizations. The fund that we started was called the Impact Credit Fund, and so we started that about a year ago, and we started funding about 5 months ago. And effectively, we partnered with Be Generous to create a easy and quick access to our Impact Credit Fund for nonprofits who are looking for either short-term, medium, or long-term capital. They email us, they provide some of the information, we can underwrite it, and sometimes we can either fund it ourselves or we can put them in front of other community banks or even commercial banks to help them to gain access. And some of that is an educational process. There's an educational process on the nonprofit of just explaining to them how they should think about underwriting and how they should think about credit. Also explaining to them how they should think about commercial banks. A lot of times, unfortunately, a lot of the nonprofits have to lend at very, very high rates, some that are too high for them to do that. And so we try to do a very competitive rate that's just above commercial banks. And that helps us help quantify each kind of dollar that we're saving some of these nonprofits goes to either, some, meal kit, food kit, another person getting either clothing or being able to do something after school. And so we have a whole marketplace that we've created for nonprofits to reach out to us and then to be able to access capital.
Yeah, that's great. I was just looking at the website, begenerous.com, the letter B, generous.com, and connecting people together for a marketplace that want to help nonprofits out. And I can't imagine if, there's stats that you hear about the effectiveness of your donated dollar. Well, if your donated dollar is going to pay interest on, principal on a principal loan, that's not going to help the cause of the nonprofit. So from a core fundamental perspective, that is an incredible mission, right, to get behind, especially for being trusted by thousands of nonprofits nationwide and loans ranging from 25,000 to 50 million. So out of curiosity, what are the most common types of needs for funding inside of a nonprofit? What are the top needs that you'd see a nonprofit have when they come to you for funding?
Yeah, so I think
that is
the easiest one that typically happens is that something happens where the donations or pledges are not at the time frame or timeline that the nonprofit expects. And we've had this unfortunately a couple of times, even with some small community colleges and university endowments where they're expecting a donation, it does not come in. and they need it for something short term. That could be either for working capital, it could be for payroll sometimes, it could be to purchase inventory, equipment. Sometimes we've had some people who have asked, said, look, we need additional money to put money into order, uniforms or things for after school programs or soccer. And so a lot of times it's very short term. On the other part, which is very good, is that the faster they pay us back, it can be a very, very low cost loan, right? So to your point, it doesn't impact the mission of what they're trying to do.
Yeah, I really like that. So especially if you want to extend your runway and there's people or material costs and that timeline in terms of that gap to when that funding will land, it's almost like it's, I won't say it. Tell us a little bit more about that intermediary time. And say someone gets a loan and that gives them, I don't know, let's just say 3 or 4 times more runway. Well, what happens if that runway ends out and they need another loan or they need to expand the impact of that loan? How does that process typically work for nonprofits?
Yeah, we're a very friendly lender. So for us, we're trying to work within the confines. And the other part that comes up a lot is state and state grants. So we've had a lot of municipal, state and state grants with a lot of disruptions over the last year, where the nonprofits are just not getting the capital in the same speed at which they expected, right? So that's another need. We've seen sometimes that they want to need to either purchase a facility, expand a facility. But typically we do loans that are friendly. So that means that we can give extensions, we can be very favorable on terms. We're not trying to put them into a bad situation where some of the other lenders may not be as favorable. We've seen a lot of people take very, very short-term loans from other people who are probably not as philanthropic as we are at extremely high rates, right? We've seen people who are paying very, very high rates on payment processing, merchant cash advance loans. Typically, we're also willing to refinance those loans out, right, to lower the cost of what they need to do that. But typically, we're trying to do everything from 3 to 6 months up to 18 to 24 months. So we're giving them enough time that hopefully that allows them to either figure out either from donations or the management or budget of the nonprofit that they can work through it.
I love that. I was going to actually ask the question about refinancing, and that's incredible that you also offer that as well. So if you are a nonprofit founder, if you're a nonprofit developer, development manager, if you're a nonprofit who's looking for additional funding, or maybe you have some bad credit, some bad financing currently, you definitely need to reach out to these folks and get that taken care of, because they're friendly fund. They're very bold about that and doing it for a good cause. So I really like to hear that.
Yeah, I think the other part also, we also try to be extremely helpful to talk about, sharing marketing tools, other technology tools to help some of the nonprofits to market better. I think that's another part where I think there's a lot of knowledge and educational sharing that we typically will find is something that we're willing to do. And it also sometimes can give longer term solutions with either commercial lenders or other people in the space that they may not be aware of. And so sometimes we can be that bridge. We can say, look, we can give you a short-term loan, then hopefully give you a bigger, larger facility with either a local lender or state or regional lender. And all of that, seems to be something that is very helpful.
Yeah, and you're also connecting the financing sources as well, such as banks or government municipalities. How do you make those pieces come together at the local level?
So as part of our marketplace, we're already partnered with dozens of different banks. So I think in one part, we're speaking to banks and credit unions that we already have a list of those firms that are already willing to donate in nonprofit. And in some cases, we're actually the one who has created both the underwriting and the way that they're thinking about their lending to nonprofits. So, we have what we call our SMART score, which is a proprietary kind of process in which we've gone through, tens and tens of, if not hundreds of thousands of nonprofits. We've back tested data, and we've created really a scoring system to understand how to think about the financial picture and scoring of what those nonprofits look like. And then we've shared that with a lot of the banks and banking communities, and that's helped them to expand the amount of people who potentially will lend into the space. And that's something that we're pretty proud of, and we think we can expand into other areas too.
That's awesome. I love that. So I'm hearing not only do you have the financing aspect, but also a real focus on marketing and technology as well, especially in an age where AI is here, quantum is coming soon, right? We have this question is like, is this AI? Obviously, a lot of things are moving there. But before we go into the technology side, I just wanted to double down on that nonprofit area of at what point, or maybe help me better understand what specifically are qualifications of a nonprofit that would qualify them to be someone that you want to work with?
Yeah, typically we need some sort of history, right? So typically if a nonprofit was started, very recently, that is the only one that is very difficult for us, right? That now the other part, it doesn't mean it's impossible, but typically we need to see, some, historical financials about what donations look like, what the business model, what their operating model is. And then typically if they have any assets, right? Sometimes those can be cash in the bank, marketable securities. In some cases, a lot of nonprofits actually own real estate. And so we just need a somewhat of a financial picture with some historical knowledge. And then a lot of times we actually get a lot of donations from people who in our network, right? We actually have a lot of people who are investors in our fund and into Be Generous who actually own or manage nonprofits, right? And so a lot of times we've seen actually people within those, they are the donor, they've done personal guarantees or some pledge, and that's really helped to kind of give us more security that this is a nonprofit that can withstand kind of borrowing money, right? Because there is an obligation to pay that money back. But I think it can be any type of nonprofit. It really doesn't matter what is. We look at all different types, all different states. And then typically we've looked at, anything that we think we can understand. And a lot of times we can sometimes also link new donors to those nonprofits, which could be quite helpful.
Yeah, that's incredible. I like to hear that when you have wealthy individuals or business organizations or groups of people who are pouring into these nonprofits, they also either whether a personal guarantee or they have connections to, they're able to donate their own assets, which then you can start bringing in an asset that doesn't apply to the nonprofit, but they want to fund the nonprofit. How does that typically work if someone is bringing maybe some things that they want to either liquidate or refinance with you?
Yeah, so typically refinance is pretty common because the cost of debt that we see can be extremely high. We've seen some nonprofits who are borrowing at, unfortunately, 25 to 40%, right? Which is just a huge drag on what they can do. Our loans are typically 11 to 13% and sometimes 9 to 11, right? So we sit right where a commercial bank is in some sense. And so we can quantify immediately, how many more, whether that's going to be helping people or number of students or people that we impact immediately, right? So that's obviously a really nice thing. The second part that relates to that, which is for us, is we actually donate a portion of the profits of the fund back into the nonprofit community, right? So we've had a lot of people who are looking at this at what I would call the pension and state level of saying this is where we can have social impact, but also with return of capital. I think some of the things that's happened over the last couple of years, people want to have impact, but they also want to see if there's an ability to make a return on that capital. And I think we're providing that, which is a very interesting part in the space. And then the dollars that are going into our fund, a portion of that is actually going back into nonprofits. So if there are nonprofits that we lend to, we've had times where we've said, look, we really like what your purpose and mission is, and we will start to become a donor to your nonprofit going forward.
Yeah, that's incredible. I like that aspect too. The fact that if someone is at that stage where they need funding and they're in a really bad deal for whatever reason, maybe it's education, as you mentioned, or just circumstances were strenuous, they had no other options, you guys are able to actually come in and help the nonprofits in that way. So I had two other questions. So the first one was, how has the role of government and political cycles, I don't want to get too political, but government typically moves slower to work with government, but also move faster than government when these nonprofits really have a true need that's sometimes immediate.
Yeah, so we've actually been lending in the government and state space for almost 4 or 5 years, right? And so we deal with a lot of both state and government contractors, right? Which is actually a fairly large part of the GDP. And I would say within that, whether it's a state level, federal level, or local or municipal level, every time that there's a administration change, there's partial disruption. So I think that is something that always occurs. And I think that happens in cycles, whether it's around the November timeframe or the January timeframe, or depending on what your election cycle is. That seems to be, continuous. So I think that's one problem. I would say also, to your point, just as a comment, over the last couple of years, it seems to be that there's a lot more feuding within both the federal and state governments. And that also continues to cause disruptions, which makes the product that we're doing even more important, right? So I think that, unfortunately, that seems to be here to stay. And I think also that the complexity of the governments is just, there's a lot of people. So when we look at people who are trying to get paid, those payment cycles are either longer than expected or they can be quite complicated. I think also the state and state municipal grants are quite complicated, and a lot of those have been delayed. So I think all those things kind of lead to, a complexity of that the cash flow and payment cycles are just not as straightforward as they used to be, and that creates short-term funding needs.
Yeah, I was thinking about that as well, that you're actually sitting at the intersection of a very well-defined problem and known problem, and it has a cyclical nature as well. And talking about cycles, maybe a little bit more macro level from an economics point of view, especially in maybe more the traditional corporate or startup funding, the landscape has changed a lot in 26 rather than say 20 to 21, 22 era. I saw a report that came out that said that funding across all industries down except for that in AI through 2024 and 2025 cycles. Obviously, funding was very frothy in 2021, 22. So how has that affected your role in the funding marketplace, given that the dynamics have even changed since then?
Yeah, I would say in general, a lot of that funding is relates to venture and venture capital, right? Venture and venture capital is, a key part of how people start businesses, how they come up with ideas. It's created a lot of technological innovation. And I would say over the last couple of years, I think there was a lot of maybe overfunding in some areas. I think a lot of those companies either raised too much capital, they were not necessarily as prudent as they should have how they invest that capital. So I think all of that has kind of led to slower funding cycles. And I think that affects a lot of people. I think also with nonprofits and some other areas, it just seems to be that is an area where people have changed the way that they allocate to those sectors, right? And I don't think it's necessarily going down, but I think it's been reallocated. I also think that there's just so many now that it gets harder for people to pick as to what they're going to donate or not donate to. So I think there's some people who have been very good at the digital marketing, typically the larger nonprofits, and that has taken money from the smaller to medium nonprofits where they just don't have either the digital marketing capability, they don't have the capital to invest to do that. So all of those create other problems in the nonprofit community. And I think also there's an increasing amount of tech and tech knowledge. It's very hard for a nonprofit to have a very, seasoned digital marketing firm. It's very difficult for them to understand how to do, digital and create ads. And I think that's where AI comes in, which has been interesting, is that people have now been able to kind of be empowered to create digital and digital marketing programs, to do content creation, short form video and editing. All of those things through, AI or some sort of tech tools are kind of empowering, I think, both small companies and other nonprofits. Then you're also seeing a lot of venture firms being shut out of the market because companies need less capital to get to product. And I think all of those things are good trends.
Yeah, while there's so much there, what I like is how the advance of future technology has kind of enabled and leveled the playing field. So for nonprofits who may be resource constrained, their resources can go further, and their message, their mission-minded message, can go further because of the advance of technology. And right, with the commoditization of that marketing, it can actually become much more affordable for a nonprofit to do that at scale without having to spend a ton of money, so they can also be faithful to that funding commitment to the financiers.
Yeah, I think one big issue has been a lot of people over the last couple of years, for multiple reasons, have not kept to their funding commitments, right? I think that's been another issue where a lot of the nonprofits are very dependent on it. And I think that's been one of the issues of how do you create more stable income streams or stable donors, right? I think those are all things, one of the challenges that nonprofits are dealing with.
Yeah, there's so many ways we could take this conversation. I want to get to the tech here soon. You have a really awesome tech background too. In terms of down rounds and nonprofits, in the venture world, you have a lot of down rounds, right? Where equity was decreased or the value of the company just decreased, or maybe they had less funding sources. From a global point of view, because you are coast to coast from Los Angeles to New York, what role does international nonprofits and global nonprofits play in your business? Is this just for US based, or what about those who have both US and global presences?
Yep. So we've started in North America, just because one, for a lot of different reasons. I think and obviously the US and North America is a big market, right? So I think that's the first place that we've started. We've done international lending in Europe and a couple other areas. I would say that there's other areas we're looking to expand into because I think this program obviously fits well. I think the only challenge is when you're trying to underwrite or understand a company or a nonprofit, you do need to have local presence. You obviously start to have language and legal issues that create some complexity. So I think the EU, we have a path to do something in the EU, which I think is going to be pretty straightforward. But also some of the other international countries have different, the concept of nonprofits is a little bit different in other countries. So, but we do want to expand to do that. I think we have a lot of nonprofits who also we're lending to that also do impact in international areas, right? So I think for us is we're trying to do the North America as the hub, which is easier, and then try to make sure that we're seeing if there's ones that we can help that might have impact internationally and incorporate that into our roadmap.
Yeah, that's good. I always like to ask that question because we do have a global audience at times as well, mostly US, but yeah, in terms of the economic philanthropy and donations yeah, it's absolutely in the US. But we're also seeing a lot more generosity coming from the Middle East and more Eastern cultures as well. So, being able to integrate that with compliance and language and legal, yeah, that's why we have specialists for the global markets, which is fantastic. So you said you'll be expanding to the EU on your roadmap. Is that for when are you planning to expand into Europe?
Yeah, so we're doing some of that now, and I would say one of the things that is helpful for us is we do a lot of stuff with the U.S. and U.S. government, right? And so that's both federal, state, municipal. We're based in New York City, but we do even try to do stuff that's local and local impact. And so typically the good part is when we ask and we do a lot of communication with different people in government, we ask them and say, where do you need us to help? Right. I think unfortunately a lot of times, natural disasters, other stuff, but we've talked to FEMA quite often of how we can help in kind of natural disaster areas. We've talked about EU and other areas. There's a couple of things that are going on with displacement, other people within the European Union. And so a lot of times we just ask the government, state, and other municipalities saying, where do you need help? Where are you seeing disruption? Where do you want programs or things that can go quicker or faster? And sometimes it's not things that we expected. We've had things where we've looked at how do we help some companies to do rural broadband. We've had things with, as I said, a lot of STEM and educational schools. So a lot of times we're just listening, and I think that kind of tells us a lot of times where the need and where we should be going.
Yeah, that's good. Wow, so much goodness there. Really appreciate the first topic that we talked about, which is how nonprofits can raise capital and secure financing. So that was our first topic. Now we're going to go to our second topic, which is how does data and AI expand capital access for nonprofits?
And so I would say on one hand, the ability to ingest data, analyze it, and look at that, I think has gotten much easier. I a long time ago started in software development, trying to understand how to do data and data analytics and data science. And so one of the first jobs I had is we were using data science and machine learning to figure out how to create a quantitative fund of how to disrupt the public markets and venture capital. And we had to take enormous amounts of data. It was very difficult. It was very time consuming, and we would get there, but it was very technical. Now there are a lot more tools where I can use almost whether it's AI agents or other different programs that I can literally ask it to do tasks that I would have had to do manually. And I think that the concept of having to understand programming and coding, you now have AI agents or coders that you can have almost for free. And so I think that's really changed the landscape of how things are done. And today we have things that we can do in minutes that would take us hours for a human to do that. And I think those we're creating our own internal both systems and software tools, and all of that are things that are making us to go quicker and faster. And I think the cost of that is going down significantly. And I think also it's getting much easier where AI tools started off almost like in a contextual search where you could type things, but they're now being integrated where you don't necessarily have to even have a software background, right? It's very intuitive. And you can see some tools now that you can ask the tool to actually create a program, and it'll actually create a software code that will interface with you and the people you work with. So all those things are kind of pretty interesting developments in AI. And we hired last year our first AI officer, right? So we have a person whose only job is to use AI to figure out how we can both improve both at our company, how our portfolio companies, and even on our borrowers. So I think all of that's moving very, very quickly, but I think it also takes a lot of time, energy, and effort. It's like continuing education. I spend time every week just trying to see what else is going on in new tech trends, what's our AI. I think you have to really kind of embrace it and want to allocate time, or else you're only going to do a portion of it. And I think that's one of the things that we're excited about, but it's also it creates a lot more work as well.
Yeah, creating a culture of learning and upskilling is so important. I'm tempted to ask which tech and tools, but I don't want this to be outdated next week or tomorrow, because we'll say a tool today and there'll be new tools tomorrow. But in terms of upskilling your staff and your team and actually investing directly in a specific role, what does upskilling look like for you internally? And then how do you typically advise nonprofits do the same so that they can make the most of their data estate?
Yeah, I mean, just on your side, I mean, I think the tools are ever changing, but there's going to be base tools, right? The same as like some people are using some base tools to do things like on word processing or presentation. So I think there's a base layer of what you can do with this. I think to your point, the tools that we use that sit on those bases will continue to change. And I think for us, we have our own custom tools now, right? We have tools that we've actually developed ourselves that we're not even using third parties. And I think that goes back to, how much time or infrastructure or people can you do that is kind of part of it. I think the other part that relates to just kind of how AI is being used is everyone's going to have a different use case. And so I think there's a lot of sub use cases of what you're trying to do with it. And I think the first part you have to figure out is what are you trying to actually do? And so I always tell people, if you can map out, whether it's a person or a group of people at your firm, map out the workflow, how you're trying to accomplish a task. And once you do that, that will start the process of thinking about how can you improve that process. And a lot of times you can type that into a tool. You can do a lot of other things that say, and I think also you can see there's 4 or 5 functions that are very clearly going to be used by AI. We're seeing a lot of people who are doing content and content creation. I think video editing, I think for nonprofits, the way you tell your story and your mission, that is clearly something that can be done better. I think how you think about digital marketing and email communication, the cadence, all that data analytics can be done with other tools. But I think it also depends on, how much data and how much time you want to do with this. I think at the end of the day, you want to understand your internal workflows, improve them, and you want to have a better communication and message to whatever your counterparty. It could be donors, it could be customers, it could be clients, it could be investors. I think all of that is, it's good to sit down and kind of think about your processes and how you can improve them. And I think the technology, if you're doing that, I think that's where I'm seeing a lot of people just sit down and talk about it, and they realize that there is ways to improve, and you can't be continuously doing the same thing. You have to kind of adapt, and that's what I think is always my best advice is what could you do to make this process better.
Yeah, I love that, absolutely, especially coming to workflow. AI is almost like a marketing term, right? Artificial intelligence. Like, what is artificial intelligence even, and what is the expansion of technology? But yeah, this idea of implementing automation, being efficient, and also adopting new technology, having a cultural leadership that actually cares about tech adoption. I mean, that's very important, because obviously without that executive sponsorship, it's difficult to implement it down at the at the ground floor. But in terms of how data and AI are expanding capital access, maybe just getting to the focus of, okay, so you have nonprofit. How can a nonprofit utilize new technology tools to get better access to capital?
Yeah, so one of the things we did is we actually went and looked and we mapped out every nonprofit that we could, right? So I think that was the first part. The other part, which is interesting about nonprofits, a lot of their financials are publicly disclosed, right? So we were able to then take all those financials and put them into a database to figure out and say, what are the key metrics as why nonprofits either survive, grow, and thrive, or don't make it. And so I think on one hand, there's a lot of data and data analytics layers. I think within that, you really have to understand kind of asking the right questions, what you're prompting it. I think you have to think about the user interface and the key metrics. And I think a lot of people have to understand is what are the key metrics you're trying to figure out. And I think going through that data, sometimes you can figure that out. Sometimes it's not obvious. But that's where data science and other tools can be helpful. They will tell you things that you cannot see by just looking at data. There are certain things you're starting to see AI and massive data sets do things for cancer and cancer research. But when the data set gets too big, that's where data and AI can be really helpful to use, a third party or some automation. And I think it's also as making sure that you can present that data in a usable form, right? So I always tell people make sure that it at least looks good. Use charts, use visualizations. People are visual in nature, so I always tell people take that data and put it into something that's visualized, right? I think there's a lot of infographics, as I call them, that can be quite helpful. You take the data, it tells a story, right? And a picture sometimes with data is better than a verbal discussion sometimes for people how fast they can do that. And I think that's a continuous journey. I think there's more and more data that's being pushed out, and so it's also a challenge of sifting through that data to make what's relevant and not relevant. And I think that gets hard. I think that's a part where it's depending. There are some data sets that are too big, right? But I think you have different things like Amazon Web Services and Google and other people who are doing things, even Microsoft, that are allowing you to ingest a lot of data for low cost. And so I think that's another key part of just understanding is if you have a lot of data, what are you going to do with it? Where do you put it? And then how do you start to get conclusions from it? And that's challenging. But then I think also that's about kind of, can you get outsourced people or teams? And I think for nonprofits, I think that for them, the data is really how to connect that to marketing, right? I think that's the key connection point. And sometimes you don't have to go through all your data. You might just go through data from one customer or a large donor. You might try to figure out when's the right time. How much should I be asking, not asking? What's the right cadence to do it? So I think, everyone has a journey that they can start and then hopefully improve upon.
Yeah. Thought that came to my mind was, what role can AI help a nonprofit understand their customer journey better? I think you might have muted yourself, Scott, accidentally. But the question was,
Yes,
how can yeah. Did you caught that right?
Yeah. So I
Good.
so I think part of that is kind of what is the mission of doing that. I think sometimes people will talk about what the nonprofit is designed to do, and sometimes with AI, there are certain words or word choices. There's other ways to kind of show that mission or purpose that help to kind of do that. I think the other part, as we've seen, is it's helped a lot of the nonprofits to use AI to create case studies, or I would almost call like a testimonial, where they can use that to go through and say, go through all the people or testimonials of what we've done, and let's try to actually better translate what we're doing at the mission to make it more personal. I think all those things are really helpful because the testimonials and what you're actually doing and the impact is really important. I think there's an emotional and a social part of that, where a lot of times the AI can go do that. It can create materials. I think also in terms of just managing the digital marketing, instead of hiring 8 or 10 people or an outside firm, it's very clear that AI can be a digital, almost digital marketing firm for you. It can also help the people you have do more. It can also do your CRM as you think about who has donated, who has not donated, who should I be in front of. I mean, there's a lot of tools now that are just such low cost that might have been 4 or 5 people in the past. And I think all of that goes back to like the operational workflow is, if you had more capital, would you hire people? Could you, instead of hiring one person, hire 2 people, but use technology? And I think all of that is just kind of going through. We've done a lot of stuff, and a couple of firms have done that, where we will share kind of what I would call the AI toolkit. And we will share it to them and say, look, this is the AI toolkit that we are using today. We've gone through, these are real firms, and this is how you should go through each one of them in each vertical and try to see if it helps you on what you're trying to do on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah, I like that. What role does AI play in capital effectiveness and reducing cost of ownership on the tech side?
So I would say this is the part where I think, AI is a good term, but it's sometimes misused, right? And I think it can be very broad, or it can be very narrow. I would say in general, AI is really an extension of a couple of different things that started with what was, data science, then machine learning, and then artificial intelligence. A lot of times AI is really people using software or software tools. And it's not what I would consider true AI, but it sits right next to it, if that makes sense. And so I think part of that is, and going back to something that it connects to data science. I think that there's a lot more information in real time that can be processed. So I think there's a lot more things that we can think, everything from weather patterns to, how the different funds are performing or not performing. Carta does a really good job of just talking about, venture investment, about, what does your peer group look? What does your data set look like? How do you compare to other people? So I think all of those are really important parts of it. But I think the other part within the AI is some of it, a lot of it is just search, right? And how you think about getting information and data. And AI does not always give a correct answer. And so I think there's some part of error So we spend a lot of time thinking about AI is, what is the quality of that AI search or prompt? What is it? How correct is it? How certain are we correct? And I think we talked before about just kind of the moral and ethics part of it. You might ask AI a question that it only is asking from the information it has. So a lot of times we look at and where is AI drawing and what is their database of information they draw from, right? I think if it's a closed data set and you're looking at your information, you can be sure. When you go out into the ethos and you start searching things from all over the world, sometimes those are narrow data sets, and that is something that you have to be very careful as kind of where they're giving you your answers from.
Yeah, that's so important. You're reminding me all of the things that Microsoft taught me, having been there for 10 years. And you're exactly right. It started as data science, really the study of the data. And then, now we have so much data. It's like we want to make sure we have high quality data. So quality in, quality out. And then, of course, to build on what you're saying, is that we do still need that human component to not only just quality check, but also make sure that we're bringing a non-biased approach and compliant, but also so that we continue to keep that human element in our technology stacks and we don't lose the human element. I think people are starting to get really AI fatigued almost. They're getting technology fatigued. There's so much AI out there. They just want the human connection. And so I like how your positioning is really more focused on nonprofits leveraging the technology for capital effective.
Yeah, I mean, we use AI across our organization, and we use a lot of. We actually have an internal platform that goes through across everything we do, everything that we're doing from diligence, analytics, peer composition. We're doing things from the underwriting aspect of it to writing investment memos. I mean, there's a lot of things that we're doing. Even we're trying to do market research and market research studies. We create a repository if we've had meetings to figure out note taking. Sometimes it's very interesting. I always joke around, if you're in a meeting and I take notes, I am never as good as the AI note taker. The AI note taker is quicker, faster. It's more organized. It sometimes does things that I've never seen. We have another one that we've had where there's an AI tool where it actually can figure out in the conversation of different inflection points, both in voice, facial features. So there's a lot of interesting things it can do. Sometimes it's needed, sometimes it's not needed, but I think it creates a lot of efficiency for us, which is helpful. But to your point on kind of what data set, we're always trying to make sure we understand exactly where it's coming from. And it's not always correct. I think a lot of times you have to keep training the AI tools you use. So we have a lot of things that are iterative, right, where we try to make them better over time. And sometimes that's repetition. Like it's, practice and repetition is always helpful. It's never perfect the first time you try it.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And you're exactly right in terms of like the capability of note taking. I mean, I still have a notebook. I don't want to give away what my Beyond the Bag is, but writing in my notebook, it's like, oh yeah, who forgot about how to actually write? And I was actually on a chicken bus the other day, and this local was looking at me and they're like, oh, you have very good handwriting. And I'm just thinking to myself, yeah, because I'm writing every day. But yeah, that idea of rhetoric and thinking, right? You can sometimes, it's almost like the calculator. If I have a calculator, why do I need to do math? Well, if you understand mathematical concepts, then yeah, the calculator answers faster. But if you're just completely relying on technology to do everything for you, yeah, there's many things that could do much more efficiently from a computational or a scientific or just like a pure scale perspective, but it still won't replace like you and me. I mean, I don't know if you're not an AI clone, but what roles do you see like video AI clones? I mean, I know you mentioned you have a head of AI as an employee. People are even saying agentic AIs and robots will replace, jobs in certain aspects of a business because it is so automation focused, or it might be so focused on future tech. So kind of navigating future tech adoption as we move into our third topic. I'm very excited about this topic because you have some background in robotics. We talked a little bit about space exploration, human existence. We talked a lot about this on this show. We had a couple other guests talking about some of those super far out there future concepts. Who even knows if they're 20, 30, 40 years out? But in terms of nonprofits and future tech, you see are those key areas of future technology that nonprofits should be considering? Let's just say maybe in the time horizon of like 2 to 3 years by 2030.
Yeah, I'd say, so for one part, I would say that one of the really good use cases for AI is education. And so if, I were in another part of the world and I did not have access to, capital or education or other stuff, there's a lot of really cool things where I've seen, remote villages and stuff where they're using an AI tool and they are creating a course and course curriculum that they can do for, for underprivileged or access to that. So I think that's a really, really cool use case for AI, where you almost have an AI teacher. It has a course load. It can check homework. It can kind of interact. It's not the same as having a teacher though, right? So I think that's one part to your point on like the communication side of having someone interactive, the emotional, the interacting with other people. AI can be kind of a lonely, one-on-one type interface. But I think it goes back to what we were talking about before on just what a nonprofit is. I think, there's different use cases. I think on one, the first part I always tell people, there's everything from email and email marketing, how you communicate. There's everything how you do digital marketing, how you create and do the communication. I think there's other parts of just understanding that you probably could understand what your access to capital is just by running an AI tool and doing an underwriting, right? It wouldn't be easy to do, but you could start to look at that. And I think the other part is kind of on the AI is how to help educate some of your, your donors or kind of what you're doing in the world. I think there's other parts of we've been talking now about, can we use our AI tool to start doing sort of rating system to help people think about what is the impact of some of the nonprofits of how they're doing it. But I think every person, you have to start and start the journey to see where it goes. I would argue and say we're seeing a lot of the nonprofits use things from, instead of having to pay for lawyers, I wouldn't suggest people do all of it, but using some of the legal to start the process of asking legal questions. We've seen HR policies, we've seen hiring policies. I think there's a lot of things that can help with some of the service providers they use, which are really interesting. And I think there's a lot of part of just, time and time management, how they manage both the people internally, how they do everything that they're doing that it could be partially automated, I think is an interesting question. I think every nonprofit is run a little bit differently. We've seen people do it for, employee management, timekeeping, starting to do what I would call like a better version of payroll. I mean, there's so many things that you can do, right? And I think typically the question is, if you're paying a service provider and you're paying money, is there a way for AI to help you to do that? I think that's an interesting question to start with, and then start to go through the different uses cases at a nonprofit.
Yeah, I love that so much. It's like, okay, so because we have nonprofits that have their public statements, now we have access to that data. We can look at the capital efficiency and inefficiencies, and then we can also technology adoption playing in that specifically. And then in terms of time management or deployment of internal communications, marketing resources, that sort of a thing. But also to your point about, how are they actually integrating that into building their own apps with vibe coding? Vibe coding is kind of all the rage right now. And if you're able to go out and build your own app software, then do you really still need all of that expensive engineering spend that has previously been invested towards, humans who are doing the coding? So yeah, you want to be efficient with your capital as well, especially for a nonprofit where capital may be constrained, or you may have your donors saying, hey, I see that you're putting my money in these areas, but actually AI could be solving some of these things. Yeah, I could see that be a future technology area where nonprofits are thinking about just doing a technology audit. Like, just look at your technology stack and identify maybe 1, 2, or maybe that you could actually get into the boat, right? If you're not even sailing in the ocean of technology, well, get in the ocean. But then if you're in the ocean, you're adopting future technology like agentic, like app development, like vibe coding, then why not take that to the step further and get in that boat too? And to your point, like upskill your people, really invest in the educational piece, the upskilling, which of course AI can help you do that as well. So yeah, it's really interesting. So I know you'd mentioned a little bit of robotics. So what role do you see robotics play in future tech?
Yeah, so we're an investor in a lot of robotics and automation companies, and typically that has to do with, if you imagine anything like storage retrieval, warehouse automation. So we do a lot of that with the companies. A lot of our customers are, universities, museums, public safety, sheriff's department, even libraries and museums. And so on the robotics side, I think a lot of people really they a lot of times are looking at things like humanoid. So they're looking at a robot on legs. I would say typically when we're doing stuff, we always have robots that are either on wheels or some sort of like rack, right? So we typically are not doing the humanoid stuff, but within that, we've seen a lot of things where there's safety and compliance issues. We things where people, they don't know where the parts of retrieval are. We've had people going up really, really high ladders on racks, and then they're carrying heavy boxes and falling. So there's a lot of safety and compliance, I think, that is happening. And I think if you imagine trying to move something through a warehouse, right, and you have hundreds and hundreds of employees is a good thing. But at some point, we've had robots where we said, look, no one really wants to work the night shift. What if we could use the robots to do a night shift and then put less strain on some of the employees so they're not there all different times of night? What if we could reconfigure the warehouse so at night it's ready to start the next morning? I think there's a lot of use cases. We've things like aerospace defense. We've seen a couple areas. We've seen auto repair, auto maintenance. I think there's a lot of different parts that are kind of different use cases. We've seen if there's areas where it's hard to hire, some retailers are looking at, is there a way to do some sort of inventory and inventory management system? Obviously, self-checkout. I think robotics is different for different people, but it's clearly going in that area, right, in some different ways. I think the humanoid one is going to take longer. So to have kind of a robotic personal assistant will probably come at some point, but I think that's longer into the future. I think most of the robotics and automation journey will be things related to manufacturing, service, inventory, how you store and retrieve certain items. I think a lot of that will be done. But I've seen robotic coffee makers at the airport. I think they're great, right? You get that. It's a lower cost of product. I've seen automated pizza makers. I mean, there's a lot of different ones that I think here and now that I've seen that actually work pretty well. And I'm looking, on one hand, I hope that robotics lowers the cost of goods and services, right? It would be great, especially since I'm in New York, to not have to pay $3 or $4 for a slice of pizza. That would be great if it was $1 or $2 like it used to be. And I can see some of the coffee machines, they're actually lower cost, which is good. We don't want to have kind of the really, really high cost items for people.
Yeah, there's so much there. I like the idea that automation and robotics and future tech is an absolute consideration. Like I would say categorically, not the humanoid bot necessarily, but yeah, if you're definitely in logistics, shipping, warehouse management, inventory, any type of that physical good, anything that's where a robot could the robots work for us, right? This is not an iRobot situation, right? We're not having Will Smith in here, where the robots take over. It's not an I Am Legend, like the end of the world. But yeah, when you think about governmental municipalities, you're talking about public health and safety, you're talking about hospitals and police and fire departments and nurses and that sort of a thing. Yeah, if you have this kind of assistant-like scenarios, then yeah, at least saying, yeah, this is important to us when we invest nonprofit. Yeah, if we need the funding to be able to go deploy these workloads or these investments in future tech, that's really important. So which nonprofits or what role do you see nonprofits playing in space and space exploration?
I would say for right now, very little, because space is a very, very expensive endeavor. So I think in one hand, I don't think that nonprofits really have the ability space is such a complicated question between, not just the robotics, the fuel and how you're making both, robotic and fuel propellant and other part. Unfortunately, it is, mostly been subsidized by governments, right? So I think that was the first part. I think SpaceX is really the first company who has privatized some of that. And then obviously you've had, Blue Origin and some other ones, but all of that has taken billions and billions of dollars to even get started. And so I think that's a hard thing to get there. From a nonprofit, because it's just so capital intensive, which is not typically a great place for nonprofits. But I do think there's a lot of government and government capital that will go and continue to go into that. There's some really interesting things that, obviously Elon Musk talks about could you do both energy and energy capture in space? I think a lot of people, the thing that I see most people getting touched by space is Starlink, right? Being able to have access to, high-speed broadband around the world. I think that's a really interesting part. I think communication, through space, I think that's the area that we'll see maybe that some nonprofits can lower their cost of access to, high-speed broadband and help other people. So I think that's where I see it for today. But I think the other part is going to be, pretty far in the future.
Yeah, I was just thinking about so many things. I was thinking about, I saw an advertisement for an AI dog the other day, and it's like, yeah, maybe I would want to have like a realistic, and the dog just looks so realistic in terms of the way that it moved around. It was only $30, so the cost definitely is coming way down on some of these little things. I think you could like pet and say things you would like kind of like I don't know if you remember this. The Gia pets or the nano pets are like these the Tamagotchis that are kind of coming back. All the kids are like, how do I keep my little, not the Furby, but how do I keep my little pet alive? But yeah, in terms of the realisticness of nonprofits investing in future tech, yeah, being capital intensive, some of those things will not make sense for nonprofit. But to your point being underwritten by governmental, it'll be interesting, like, can we harness space energy, and what role does quantum even play into that? I know we like to talk about quantum topics on here. What are your thoughts on quantum? Quantum is quite broad. What do you see the intersection of quantum and nonprofits?
Yeah, so I think quantum, is a very, very interesting but very complicated technology, and I think it's very clear that that is the future of kind of what you can do with both compute and computing. So I think there's part of that. I think it goes into data processing, goes into a whole bunch of other research and other academic areas. Most of the areas I see in quantum is still somewhat exploratory right now. I think we're starting to see parts of it, but it really reconfigures both, how you think about semiconductor chips and how you think about a computer and compute and how you process stuff. And I think the part with it, what I see within that, I don't know how it's going to intersect yet, because I think it's far enough commercial, right? I think we have to see how it kind of intersects into the commercial market before we intersect in the nonprofit market. But it's a fascinating topic. It is clearly there. I think there's some physics and other parts of it that have to keep doing that. But that is one of the parts that the government is clearly focused on, about how do we get to the next generation of computational processing. And it's be interesting to watch. But for nonprofits, I hope all these new tech help them to make them be able to do more social impact.
I love it. So the other aspect there is sustainability, energy management, and nuclear. In terms of future tech, we see nuclear often being, especially a small factor nuclear, being able to sit aside or next to the classical hardware in the data center. So what role, if any, does nuclear play into future tech?
Yeah, I think the part with that is there's a lot of different ways to get energy, and I think some of them are, less or more environmentally friendly. Nuclear is actually very environmental friendly. If you look at what's going on in Asia, that's a key area of investment. And I think there's obviously a lot more energy and energy need for the grid, not just from AI, but because of people and population growth. And so there's nuclear, which people kind of view as like, large nuclear reactors. I think with the small modular reactors, which are kind of the next gen of that, are smaller, extremely safe as far as I can tell. And that's going to be something that will help, I think, to help drive innovation. And I think, for everyone, lower electricity is a key component of increased productivity, increased GDP. So I think all of that, the small modular nuclear, I think there's going to be another part of nuclear that will kind of help to create more energy for a lot of good uses. And I think that's something that we're watching. We're seeing a lot of different applications for data center that are coming out of it. And I think also to take less strain on the grid, make sure people have power for, both summer and winter and heating and things like that. So I think that's an area that's going to be one to watch that has a lot more to do, but also in the near term.
Yeah, absolutely love that. Okay, well, I feel like we could probably talk for a long time, but our show time's coming up, and we have a special segment called the Beyond the Bag segment. We talked about this here, Traveler. What is in your bag? We're curious.
I've got a lot of things. I mean, most of them, I would say that, but most of my main thing is my charging. But the other part is besides I'm charging, my actual like iPhone or iPad, this is basically my Anker mega charger that I can charge 6 or 8 different charges across my different components. And I would say this has not just been helpful for me, but I've seen a lot of other travelers who they've run out of, whether it's their smartphone or their iPad or et cetera, that you can link into this and save that. And I've actually used it almost to help other people as well, not just myself, but not having to constantly plugged into at the airport or somewhere else, or not having any electrical outlet is always nice to have something that can do 8 or 10 charges. And then I don't have to worry about it is key in my bag.
I love that. Actually, it reminds me, I have my own here. This actually is a Central American charger made in China, but I got it in Central America. And actually, it's nice because it's got all of the chargers. So if you have Lightning or USB-C or Type-C or even mini USB. And then I was actually running a little bit out of charge. So someone else brought their charger to charge my charger that was charging someone else. It was just a meta experience. It was so fun. But my Beyond the Bag item today is a highlighter. And I am traveling very light on this trip, just one small little Tumi bag. And the highlighter actually helps me reflect and look back at things that I've written this past year. This is a journal that I write in every day, and the highlighter helps me see what's important. All right, so as we come to a close, Scott, this is incredible. It's good connecting with a fellow Midwesterner. City for a long time. I'm a baby New Yorker. I don't claim to be from New York, but I do enjoy being in the city. I'm glad that I'm not in the city right now. I'm 85 degrees right now, where it's -9, I think, and 12 inches of snow. But I want to just give you a chance to give people an opportunity to stay connected with you, and also, where can people find you?
Yeah, typically the easiest place I tell people is, I post a fair amount on LinkedIn. So I think that's under Scott Stevens at Grays Peak Capital. That's a place where I'm typically an easy place to reach me. And the other part is, if you do info@grayspeakcapital.com, that's another place where it's easy, whether it's you have ideas, questions, comments, you want to know, if you want to understand what we're doing in nonprofit, or if you have a nonprofit that makes sense, please email that. That email does go to me, so I do see it. That's probably the easiest way. And I'm always interested to watch other people on their social media and see what they're posting. So I'm an avid ingester. And then Be Generous, who is our nonprofit marketplace. That is another key part of our partnership of how we're helping to kind of build the nonprofit and lending community. So that is the other firm that we work with that's really important. And then, our Impact Credit Fund, that's something we continue to do more and more with. And so that's something that, if you have questions about that, we have a little blurb on our website. We have a lot more information, but there's a lot of information you can see.
Awesome. You can see I'm just glowing of this episode of the David Daly Show, with a special segment on funding, faith, future tech with you, Scott. It's been a pleasure. We'll see you folks next time. Have a great day.